The room smelled of citrus and nervous perfume, of polished wood and too old champagne. Crystal chandeliers scattered light across silk and sequins, each sparkle a small, deliberate promise of what the night would mean to its guests. Status, headlines, favors owed and to be collected. At the center of it all, under the white glare of camera flashes, he moved like a man used to being admired. Terrence Sterling had perfected the public smile of ownership. Tonight he wore it as a coat, custom cut, unchecked arrogance beneath. He led a woman in a red dress by the elbow, head held high, the dress a slash of color that made 100 tongues whisper and 100 eyes follow. Immani stood at the edge of the room, hands folded in a quiet brace against a table, the leather of her clutch warm from her palm. Her dress was simple, black, spare lines, the kind of dress that refused to shout. It made her seem, to those who wanted a narrative, like a wife who kept the house and admired from the wings. Then Terrence turned, and the room rearranged itself to a single point of spectacle. He paused, theatrically, on the riser near the band, and let the red-dressed woman step forward into the light. Cameras leaned in. Laughter rose like a tide. He held up a small object between two fingers. Immani saw it, the way the light caught on its smooth curve. A wedding band. The room exhaled in collective complicity, as if witnessing some clever joke. Terrence smiled with the presumption of a man who believed his life a story everyone had already agreed should end the way he preferred. Then his voice lowered so that the circle of people nearest him and the microphones could hear. 3 words, sharpened and precise, like a ceremonial blade. "You're nothing." The phrase landed without theatrics, a carefully aimed dismissal that had been rehearsed for their faces and for the cameras. It was not just what he said, it was how he said it, an act meant to convert private betrayal into public truth. He closed the minor ritual by pressing the band into the red dress's palm and, with the same casual flourish, kissed her cheek. Applause bubbled, and then swelled. Laughter, the shifting of weight from one foot to another. A toast raised. Someone near the front muttered that it had been inevitable. Immani felt the room narrow to the size of the ring in that hand. For an instant, everything fizzed. Light, sound, color. Then she heard a smaller, calmer voice in her head. Leave the spectacle to them. She did not snatch for the band, did not flinch. She simply stepped back, took the breath she had learned where there were no cameras, and let the world behave as it wanted. There would be time later for the things the world had thought were lost. She had, after all, a habit of keeping receipts. If you want the whole story, stay with me. There's more to it than the ring and the red dress. She had been born to a small house at the edge of the river, where the wind wrote itself into the reed beds and her mother's voice made everything sensible. Aurelia Sterling had not been wealthy in the way the guests tonight insisted on being, but she had the sort of wealth that mattered, a stubborn, precise mind and a ledger. She liked lists. She taught Immani to make them. The list of what belonged to you, the list of what could be kept, the list of debts to repay in the world that would come. When Immani was small, her mother would sit her on the kitchen counter and trace letters into her palm. Name it, own it, protect it. The leather journal, worn, small, the corners smoothed by 30 years of handling, appeared one winter evening, the gift of a woman who loved ink and order more than toys. Aurelia had given it with a seriousness that suggested the instrument contained some secret recipe for life. Measure twice, sign once, Aurelia told her, pressing a warm palm over Immani's. And when they try to take what is yours, you show them the paper. Immani learned the rhythm of that smaller, steadier life, the language of ledgers, the patience of counted margins, the economy of attention. By the time she left the university lab, her hands inked with midnight experiments and her hair smelling of solder and coffee, she carried the leather journal with her like a talisman. She wrote in it the hours she had worked, the designs that would become patents, the mood of investors and the way a boardroom grew quiet when someone presented a paper with dates and signatures. In the journal, she named the company she imagined, Sterling. The name felt right, a private homage to her mother and a deliberate irony. Sterling as in silver, as in quality, as in something carried forward. In a dorm room with papers strewn like confetti and a whiteboard crowded with equations, she had realized the practical fulcrum that would make their work valuable. It was not a single dramatic idea. It was a sequence of small improvements, an algorithm for mapping subterranean stress, a more efficient extraction arm, a method to reduce environmental impact. People like to call founders visionaries, but Immani thought of herself as someone who kept receipts and signatures. She filed patents. She drafted articles of incorporation. She wrote the first business plans in a hand that trembled with coffee and a single-minded joy. Later, when investors began to circle and Sterling transformed from a late-night venture to a corporation that bought its first office, the legal papers bore one unmistakable mark: her name. Articles of incorporation, Sterling Global Holdings, dated 08/18/2007, signed, Immani Sterling, founder. She framed photocopies in a shabby apartment and kept the originals in a safe deposit box with a bank that smelled of cleaning fluids and old money. That was the kind of practical faith Immani's mother had meant. Paper, signatures, witnesses. The law could not be charmed or humiliated in the same way a dinner guest could be. She had found, with the stubbornness of someone who had spent years testing assumptions in a lab, that the world responded to proof. Marriage had been an odd detour, a convenience at first. Terrence had seemed to fit the picture the world expected. Handsome, polished, a man who could speak to investors in a way that made them write checks. He said the right things in the right cadence, leaned into cameras like a practiced orator. The first years were a partnership of sorts. He networked, she engineered. But as the company grew, credit shifted. Press releases began to share space between her designs and his statements. He liked to reframe the narrative in ways that made her look like a supportive spouse rather than an active architect. Editors liked drama. Readers liked personalities. It is rare, she thought, for two people to inhabit the same corporation and not concede on living terms. Terrence told the world an easy story, that he had steered Sterling's rise. The world, hungry for heroes and villains, accepted him. People were not cruel necessarily, they were merely willing partners in the convenience of an agreed falsehood. At first the lies were small, an offhand phrase in an interview, a caption on a staged photo. Then Lorraine Sterling, Terrence's mother, began to make herself public in ways that transformed private preference into social decree. Lorraine was an emblem of old money's dismissal. Her wardrobe was a museum of brand names. Her charm was a series of calibrated smiles that implied everyone else should be grateful for her presence. She took to calling Immani adorable, in the way one might call a theorem cute, a word that reduced complexity into something decorative. Shanice, Terrence's sister, was another kind of disturbance. Bright and hungry for advantage, she learned the shape of allegiance early and took it. Together with Lorraine, they made a household that could convert affection into an expectation of deference. At dinners now, they spoke as if the society of their company and its fortunes were family property to be parceled out, to those who could play the right role. Immani smiled politely and kept her hands to herself. She kept the ledger. Bianca Hayes arrived slowly, like a rumor at first. She was a gracefully confident presence who worked her way from a mid-level operations post to vice president, the rise marked by talent and an opportunistic charm. She was, in social lighting, everything Terrence liked to parade, striking, sure, the sort of woman who accepted being displayed. The romance that bloomed between Bianca and Terrence was, when it finally moved from rumor to reality, a crude demonstration of the patriarchal assumptions that had long threaded through their lives. A man's choice became his to make. A wife's possession was everyone else's permission to comment upon. The humiliation at the gala was not a first for Immani. At cocktail parties, she watched Terrence accept toasts with the same smooth complacency he wore tonight. At board dinners, she listened while ideas she had proposed were rephrased and applauded under his name. But the ring, his gesture of literal exchange, transformed private grievance into public contempt. When he pressed the band into another woman's hand, his action spoke of disposability. To him it was a theatrical shrug, a small bling transferred, a marriage discarded for the thrill of the visible new. What he failed to understand, and what the crowd would not be given time to consider between glasses and applause, was that not all treasure is visible as a ring. Some were written on parchment, recorded in ledgers beneath the polished surfaces of corporate pride. After the gala, when the music had been turned down and the red dress had been escorted through revolving doors, Immani went to the back corridor where the sound softened. A security guard, who had known her since the company leased the loft that would become Sterling's headquarters, watched her in a way that held no surprise. He had seen the pattern of her moving through crises. He had seen the leather journal tucked beneath her arm since she took the train to her first investor meeting, with a borrowed suit and an audacity built from necessity. Immani unlocked the neutral face she kept for the public and folded it into something narrower, more precise. She walked with the quiet certainty of someone who had prepared for contingencies. She had not come to the gala unarmed. Her weapons were paper, law, and the patient, almost clinical accumulation of evidence. In the following weeks, the pattern of her life narrowed and intensified in a way that made it feel like a plan revealed by geometry. She met with Daniel Alvarez, the corporate counsel who had been her ally from the earliest days, an exacting man with a gray temple and a way of making legal phraseology feel like a scalpel. He brought with him binders, copies of original filings, certified affidavits, the sort of documents that looked dull when placed on a coffee table and carried the force of history when read aloud. Immani had also secured the support of a board chairman who was not enthralled by social theatricality. Edward Hale, pragmatic and fastidious, who cared more for audit trails than for appearances. He had been an early investor who knew the difference between the spin of narrative and the weight of a signature. Immani had called him in quietly after the gala. He had listened, and then he had spoken in short, decisive sentences. He could convene the board in a manner that would not be easily obstructed by public relations. He understood that if the evidence was presented properly, a board measured by fiduciary duty could act with the right authority. The leather journal reappeared in these meetings like a compass. Immani kept notes in the margins of legal papers, drawing small arrows to dates and names. Her hand moved with a surgeon's steadiness. She pointed out the articles of incorporation, the original stock ledger, and the patent filings that bore her signature. Articles of incorporation, Sterling Global Holdings, Do 8/18/2007. Founder, Immani Sterling. Patent filing, No. U.S. 2009, 24381. Date of filing, 03/02/2010. Inventors, Immani Sterling. She did not speak in vengeance. She spoke in sequence and law. The documents told their own contempt for rumor. But the most delicate piece of all was not corporate at all. It was family, and it lived in the cool, precise language of a trust document that had been written long before anyone in her husband's circle had imagined that a rural diamond field could be worth more than a town's GDP. Aurelia had been careful. Years earlier, when the world was simpler for her and when motherly foresight still shaped their home, she had insisted on legal shelter for the family assets. She had executed a declaration, the Sterling Family Trust, dated 09/03/2002, with a stipulation that interested lawyers read and nod at in courtrooms years later. The trust declared that certain real property and corporate interests were to be held for the benefit of a named successor upon Aurelia's passing. Among the assets listed in dry, unadorned legal language was a controlling interest in Moreto Holdings Limited, a holding company that, through a chain of subsidiaries, held proprietary extraction rights to a site known in industry documents as the Kalahari Fields. The phrasing was exact. All interests, rights, and equities held in Moreto Holdings Limited, including but not limited to mineral rights, surface leases, and voting securities related to Kalahari Fields, to be held in trust for the sole benefit of the named beneficiary. Aurelia had added a clause Immani saw now as more than prudence, almost a prophecy. The trustee, when acting under the trust's powers, was to be vested with full authority to manage, lease, or otherwise exercise control over the assets in the best interest of the beneficiary and subject to fiduciary duty. In plain language, that meant that the trust could not be casually redirected by a husband's social maneuvers or by the fulsome opinions of a mother-in-law. Paper had been for Aurelia a way to translate love into legal armor. No one at the gala had yet read the trust. Nobody had seen the scanned copy Immani's lawyer carried now, stamped and certified. The document had been lodged in a secure trust office years ago, understood perhaps by some who knew family architecture, but not by the public who liked to see marriages end in soap opera gestures. Terrence's assumption of power rested on the public face. He signed press statements, sat in board photos, took official credit in interviews that never mentioned who drafted the engineering briefs or who sat up late with the budgets. He liked to imagine that the final decisions were his because he liked the posture of a man who could command a room. He did not know how the ledger had kept another record. Immani moved with deliberate slowness now, the kind she had practiced in labs where haste broke more things than patience. She gathered a team that was quiet but effective. There was Maya, the young engineer she had mentored since Maya's internship days, who could speak about the patents with a clarity that neutralized spin. There was Lyle, a stylist who understood the politics of image and who would help present her not as a scorned woman, but as an executive whose presence mattered. There was Jasper, the small, meticulous videographer who could edit a montage that leaned on documents rather than drama. Every piece of the plan abided by the rules of proof. They secured certified copies of the trust. They obtained affidavits from the trust's administrator, confirming chain of custody and the beneficiary clause. Daniel Alvarez arranged for notarized statements verifying the signatures on the original articles and patent filings. The board chairman, Edward, read the papers and nodded, forming the backbone for an action that would be both legal and public. Nothing in their design relied on rumor, on hearsay, or on anything that a quick inquiry could undo. Immani practiced the measured cadence of her narration. She would speak in declarative sentences, let the documents breathe, and allow the law to do what the party had tried to do with a kiss and a laugh, convert a public lie back into a provable fact. The plan was not vengeful. It was a correction. She wanted the company and its reputation restored, but she wanted something more, a recalibration of the story that had been told about her for too long. In private, she read the leathered journal aloud to herself in the dark room of her apartment, testing the wording of a line she intended to use in the gala presentation. They will try to make your absence into a shape. They will name it for you. Her fingers found her mother's handwriting in the margins, an earlier admonition to secure the heirs and the holdings. She imagined, if only for a second, Aurelia's small smile, the way the mother would have liked the meticulousness of the plan. The journal, all scrawled entries and careful dates, contained the voice that had taught her to name and protect. It was, in effect, the moral map she had carried into a room where social currency often outbid actual invention. The months of preparation were not dramatic in the way gossip likes to be. There were no midnight break-ins, no whispered threats, no illegal surveillance. There were instead long conferences, careful letters, certified mail. A legal team filed motions to update registered ownerships when the trust required it, to make sure the filings would stand scrutiny. The trustees appointed and consented, per Aurelia's specifications, in a sequence that made later challenges difficult. They arranged for independent audits. They lined up legal counsel to answer the inevitable PR questions should the reveal lead to lawsuits. In their world, law and procedure were the unglamorous work that produced outcomes. Terrence continued, oblivious in his gilded orbit. He took a summer holiday and returned to headlines that still framed him as the comfortable, smiling executor of the family's social capital. At dinners with Lorraine and Shanice, he would tell the same stories, about meetings he allegedly chaired, about decisions he had supposedly made. He brushed off Immani's suggestions with courteous but thin smiles. In private, he accused her of being overly cautious. In public, he seemed astonished at the idea that she might stand up to him. To him, her restraint was a kind of permission he had assumed. Bianca, meanwhile, found in Terrence a man who enjoyed being seen and who needed to be applauded. She wore his ring now on a chain, a small provocative thing she would show like proof of conquest. She took to posting photographs, smiling in meetings, circulating memos that reworded initiatives Immani had launched months earlier. The company gossip consolidated into a single mantra. Terrence made the public choices. Immani smiled and managed the details. The difference between public assumption and private truth grew like a shadow bending toward sundown. The more the world misread her, the more Immani focused on what she could control. She funded a small legal research team to prepare for the potential contest that would follow any public assertion of ownership, a predictable attempt to smear or to muddy facts. Her counsel rehearsed scenarios, anticipating motions and counterclaims, arranging each move as if in chess. She insisted on transparency with the board. Each action they took would have a paper trail and an audit. There would be nothing extra-legal about her correction. There would be no room later for accusations of impropriety. In the quiet before the public moment, she worked with Jasper on a montage that would do what words alone could not: show a room the chronology. It would cut, with photographic precision, between a dorm room whiteboard annotated in 2006, a patent filing stamped in 2010, the leather journal's margin that read, "Sterling, name it," a trust document with Aurelia's signature, and then, slowly, insistently, the image of a worn wedding band in a small velvet box. The screen would not shout. It would present. Documents would not scream. They would reveal. She rehearsed how the room would react. The hushing of champagne glass against stem, the small coughs that became silence, the sensation of sound falling off like a tide. She imagined the look on Terrence's face, the specific confusion of a man suddenly made small by facts. She did not relish his humiliation. She expected it to be inevitable. She wanted the company and the truth to be restored more than she wanted portraituring any private satisfaction. Friends and confidants left her room at night with the sense of being part of something logical and inevitable. Maya, the young engineer, leaned against the window and watched the city lights. "It's like watching a lab test finally yield a result," she said. Lyle adjusted a jacket lapel, reminding Immani that the optics needed to be precise. Edward Hale, when the time came for him to agree to the sequence, tapped a page and said simply, "This will stand up in court." Daniel Alvarez, as ever, read the trust and smiled, the small, slow smile of a man who knew he had seen the right document at the right time. There were, of course, risks. Terrence could take sudden legal action. He could, through his mother's money and family connections, create a confusing fog to slow the board. He could hire counsel to file emergency motions. He could call the press. There might be lawsuits. There might be people who clung to the narrative they preferred. But the documents, the originals, the certified copies, the documented chain of custody, were not stories you could invent overnight. Immani spent one afternoon alone with the leather journal and a single photograph of her mother on their porch. In the photograph, Aurelia leaned back on a weathered wood chair, hair windblown, hands clasped. Her eyes suggested an impatience with small talk and a delight in calculation. Immani closed the journal and carried it like an oath into the rooms where the presentation would be assembled. The week of the company anniversary, Sterling Global's invited guests were a particular cross-section: investors, analysts, board members, a smattering of journalists, and the social circle that loved to measure its self-worth by who spoke at the right parties. Terrence and Bianca entered like a royal procession, and Lorraine and Shanice settled in the front like a pair of spectators, sure they had already seen the end of the story. Cameras set and lenses gleamed. Behind the scenes, Immani dressed matter-of-factly. Lyle pinned a brooch near her collar. Not a gaudy thing, but a small, silver pin that looked, at a glance, like a coin. He had chosen it for its understatement. In a room fond of statements, understatement was a kind of argument. Jasper checked the files one last time, ensuring the montage would not falter. Maya tuned her presentation to the scientific language that would render the patents unassailable to those who preferred gossip to detail. Daniel Alvarez walked her through the sequence. Present the corporate history, show the patents, authenticate the incorporation papers, reveal the trust deed, call the board to enforce the trust's directives. Edward would stand and, if needed, move the board to revoke certain executive privileges that Terrence had taken on without authorization. All of it would be done in public, because the truth needed finally to be visible in the same medium that had been used to humiliate her. The leather journal found its way into the montage as well, a page turned in close focus so the handwriting could be seen, and the notation, "Sterling, name it," would appear like a signature of intention. The wedding ring, which Terrence had treated like a prop, would be shown in close-up in juxtaposition with the trust deed. The image would be symbolic and factual at once. The man exchanged a private token. The woman possessed a legal instrument of far greater consequence. By then the plan had become a ritual of pragmatic patience. Immani rehearsed her lines in a corridor away from cameras. She would not cede the stage to emotion. She had discovered through years of small defeats that anger, when presented as drama, is often received as spectacle rather than fact. She would allow documents to do the speaking. She would let the law have its say. On the night the company celebrated another year of growth, the ballroom buzzed with the usual appetite for performance. People who made their livelihoods by being seen were at their best. Terrence took the improvisational path he liked best, leaning into the microphones, making a speech about leadership, about new directions. He spoke as if the company were the map by which all opinions should be measured. Then, because the evening's program had a place for surprise, the house lights in the room dimmed almost imperceptibly. A hush, the kind people make when the conversation is about to change course, spread like a thin film. Glasses lowered, conversation faded. In a projection room, a technician placed a clicker in Jasper's hand. Jasper's fingers were steady. At the table, the binders lay like the tools of a surgeon prepared on a tray. Immani adjusted her brooch and felt the weight of a lifetime of small decisions settle into her chest. She walked toward the stage not like someone stepping into a trap, but as a person joining a long, overdue accounting. As she waited in the wings, she thought of the leather journal under her arm, and of Aurelia telling her to measure twice and sign once. She thought of the pages that bore the names and dates, things the world had dismissed because they were not flashy. She thought of the ring in Bianca's hand, a symbol for an exchange that had meant little to Terrence, and too much to the gathering of people who liked to make simplified moral pictures. She could see Terrence at the podium, smiling, believing the night would end with applause. He did not yet know the measure of the papers he had not read. He did not understand that ownership had been charted in ink long before his most theatrical gestures. He had traded a ring for a red dress. He had not imagined the ledger that would make that trade look absurd. Jasper stepped closer to the console. Lyle adjusted the microphone. Daniel cleared his throat, the low sound of one accustomed to the weight of words that had legal consequence. Edward Hale's hands found the arms of his chair, ready to stand. Maya, keeping close to the projection laptop, pressed a final key. Lights on the stage shifted. A photograph appeared, then another. Each slide was a small piece of history, a dorm whiteboard with a date scribbled on the corner, a patent filing with Immani's name, the ledger of stock allotments, a trust document with signature lines. The ballroom's ambient noise thinly frayed, then held. Glasses paused mid-air as the screen made a patient, methodical argument. In the wings, Immani listened to the room subside into attention. She felt something simple and new. Not triumph, not humiliation returned, but the mechanical satisfaction of ordered facts doing what facts always do when they're allowed to speak, their inevitability. She let the montage move at its deliberate pace, each image a small, granular correction to the public story. The projection moved toward the page she had feared and hoped for in equal measure. The trust deed, Aurelia Sterling's precise, flourishing signature, dated. The camera tightened on the clause of interest. The words were as plain as law allowed. The trustee shall hold and manage all real property, including all interests in Moreto Holdings Limited, for the exclusive benefit of the named beneficiary, Immani Sterling. She felt the air change in the room as if a breeze had passed through a closed hall. People shifted, subconsciously counting the implications. Terrence's smile thinned, just enough for shadow to show. Lorraine's hand tightened on her glass. Shanice's conversation stopped mid-sentence. Bianca looked at Terrence, then at the screen, and for the first time that evening she saw the photograph for what it was. Not an accessory to a story, but a document with teeth. The montage did not speak of diamonds as jewelry. It spoke of legal control, a chain of ownership and the corporate mechanisms that turned mineral rights into leverage. The screen displayed a map, a modestly technical figure annotated with coordinates, and then a document title that read in sober type, Deed of Assignment, Moreto Holdings nodded. Kalahari Fields Mineral Rights. Registered 11/05/1999. The camera returned to the trust clause, now highlighted with a legal administrator's stamp. Verified. Chain of custody. Trust files. Sterling Family Trust. Immani kept still. She waited for the silence the montage would bring. A silence that did not ask for applause but for comprehension. The room was listening now. The truth, like a machine starting up, had rhythm and inertial force. She thought briefly of the ring held by the red dress in a photograph the montage had already shown. An image of Terrence's small theatrics, the band on an open palm. The contrast between that intimate performative gesture and the legal paper on the screen felt, in its own strange way, like poetic justice. One was an act meant for the immediate pleasure of a crowd. The other was a document meant to endure. Behind the glass of the projection room, Jasper's finger hovered over the next slide. He was about to move the montage to a frame that would show, in close detail, the culmination of Aurelia's care. A chain of legal documents proving, step by step, the transfer of controlling interest in Moreto Holdings into the trust designated for Immani. The music in the ballroom, soft and ambient until now, faded into an expectant hush. Immani inhaled the way she had been taught to inhale during exams and long assembly tests. Steady, counting, composed. She could feel in the chest the slow, technical satisfaction of someone who had built a case line by line. The room held its breath with her, not knowing the scale of what the papers implied. Jasper pressed the button. The next image bloomed onto the screen. It was, at first glance, a page of small, exact script. The registration confirmation of Moreto Holdings mineral rights. Then the camera pulled back, and the line between abstract legal phrase and tangible reality became visible. The words made the room's silence into a new kind of noise. The sound of thinking, of people rearranging assumptions they had once considered fixed. Immani stepped toward the lights. She would speak now. Her voice would not be melodrama. It would be measured and clear. The documents were in place to do the rest. The room waited for the next move, for the way a sequence of papers transforms rumor into recorded history. She adjusted the microphone and let the screen behind her continue to present the evidence she had spent years gathering. The leather journal lay, unostentatious, on the lectern beside her. A small, familiar weight. As she lifted her chin to address the room, the moment stretched like the final quiet of a breath held too long. The gallery lights sharpened, and the faces in front of her became maps of surprise and doubt. Terrence watched with an expression that could still become either indignation or denial. Lorraine found her compulsion to cluck at the world briefly dulled. Bianca, hands clasped, had the look of someone who realized she had been cast into a role she did not comprehend. Immani's voice, when she allowed it to be heard, was calm. She had learned to speak in declarative sentences that allowed nothing to be argued away by emotion. "Good evening," she said. "Tonight I will show you something simple. The company we have built and the assets it manages are governed by documents. They are dated, signed, and verifiable. I will also show you the instrument that governs a significant asset currently held in trust for me, an instrument executed by my mother. Please watch." The room listened. The montage clicked to the next slide. A deed of assignment, the corporate seal, the signature of Aurelia Sterling. The sentences on the screen were not dramatic. They were bureaucratic, and therefore unimpeachable. They spelled out what Terrence had never bothered to read. For a long breath the gallery remained still, an audience straining to reconcile its preferences with the facts now placed plainly before it. The chandeliers continued to shimmer. Somewhere a fork tapped a plate. The silence that gathered around Immani's words had the density of history reasserting itself. She spoke no words of malice. She did not cackle at the sight of her husband's discomfort. She let the documents sit between them, and they did what documents do. They refused to be charming or cruel. They merely existed. When she finished, the room did not explode into noise. It could not. For once, spectacle had been countered with procedure, and procedure is an uneven, patient animal that tends not to submit to instant verdicts. In the wings, Jasper breathed out and the projection lab hummed. The story had moved, an event that would require people to reconsider. The next moves would be administrative, legal, and public. Edward Hale would stand and call a board meeting. Daniel Alvarez would send out formal notices people would call their lawyers. Terrence, who had once believed the world would applaud him for his confidence, found himself thrust suddenly into a landscape where confidence without document could not stand. Immani stepped off the stage and into the corridor that smelled faintly of roses and cleaning fluid. For the first time in years, she understood the peculiar quality of a moment where the world chose to be reasonable. She felt no exultation. She felt a calm so steady it might have been a new kind of grief or perhaps a kind of peace earned by earned patience. She let the corridor's hum fold around her and thought not of victory, but of work. The paperwork to file, the letters to send, the stewardship to begin. Edward Hale did not waste a moment. He stood during the stunned silence that followed Immani's presentation and, with the gravity of a man who had known boards and balance sheets longer than most had held briefcases, called for an immediate meeting. Daniel Alvarez, precise and unflappable, sent formal notices to the exchange and to internal compliance. The boardroom that had so often provided theater for press photographs now became, in a single afternoon, an instrument of due process. The first visible consequence was administrative and small, and it had the peculiar cruelty of turning performance into procedure. Terrence's executive access card failed at the employee entrance the next morning. He pressed the reader with a practiced impatience, watching the little red light pulse disapprovingly. The security guard, who had always greeted him with a deferential nod, looked at the screen, then at Terrence, and said in a voice that matched the rhythm of policy, "The board has suspended your access pending review." There was no relish in the guard's tone, only the undeniable obligation of someone following instructions. Terrence called his lawyer with a cadenced fury that had been useful in investor rooms. He demanded statements, emergency meetings, injunctions. Lorraine phoned the social editors. Shanice tightened her jaw and called a consultant who specialized in reputational rehabilitation. Bianca, who had felt the comfortable warmth of Terrence's public affection, found herself suddenly poorly briefed on legal realities. The ring she had worn as a pendant and photographed for private triumphs now felt unmoored, an accessory to a scene stripped of its props. Public relations moved as they always did, first denial, then equivocation, then the slow, exhausted acceptance that documents are persuasive. Terrence's spokespeople released a statement that spoke of organizational restructuring and the need for an orderly transition. Lorraine wrote to certain patrons expressing concern and surprise. Shanice posted a brief statement about family privacy. Their words were measured because they had to be. Reality had begun to demand accounting. Inside the company, the board convened with a calmness that felt practiced. Immani did not seek revenge on paper. She sought clarity. Edward read the trust aloud and slowly, and proposed motions that adhered to the exact language Aurelia had left. The trustee would assume management responsibilities consistent with fiduciary duty. The board voted, in a sequence of clipped, recorded minutes, to recognize the trustee's authority and to enforce the operating provisions that flowed from Moreto Holdings' controlling interest. It was a vote that required no melodrama, only signatures, a stamp, and the careful click of a pen against paper. With the board's action came operational changes that undercut the illusions Terrence had built. Certain executive privileges were revoked, not as theatrical punishment, but as necessary reallocations. Signatory authority for the group's mining and resource operations shifted to a committee chaired by Edward and overseen by the trustees' council. Press releases were drafted that emphasized continuity for investors and a commitment to transparent governance. These were the mechanisms by which a public lie returned to private accounting. Terrence attempted, briefly and loudly, to weaponize narrative. He called interviews, issued emotional social posts that made him look like a husband wronged by paperwork. The cameras obliged for a night, the talk shows weighed the spectacle. But the pieces of paper Immani had laid out did what they were designed to do. They made claims verifiable. Reporters who cared to be thorough asked for certificate numbers, chain of custody affidavits, trustee consents. The documents stood up under scrutiny. The theatrics, when compared to notarized filings, looked thin. Bianca's fate was quieter. She was asked to step down from her role pending an internal review of conflicts of interest and a re-examination of delegation of authority. She accepted the request with the look of someone who had been invited to expel herself from a house she had not helped build. There was no public shaming beyond the necessary reporting. There was, however, the steady erosion of opportunity. Key industry partners were wary of association. Colleagues who had admired her networking instinct now watched their LinkedIn feeds with a small practical suspicion. Without the advantage Terrence's public affection had provided, Bianca discovered the limits of a climb built on borrowed illumination. Lorraine and Shanice experienced consequences more social than legal. Lorraine's invitations dwindled. The same salons that prized her curated taste found themselves reluctant to be attached to someone now publicly associated with questionable stewardship. Shanice's career advantages, board seats, consultancy gigs, were quietly rescinded by those who did not wish their names joined to the unfolding uncertainty. Both felt the shape of exclusion, not out of malice but as an institutional preference for risk aversion. In short order, opportunities closed the way doors close in a storm, with a polite firmness. But the largest, most substantive work was not punitive. Immani understood that her inheritance, literal control of Moreto Holdings' share in the Kalahari fields, was not merely a trophy to brandish. It was an asset with human consequences. Labor forces, local communities, environmental impact, and a history of extraction that had rarely accounted for long-term stewardship. Aurelia's trust had passed authority. Immani now had the moral and legal obligation to act. Her first public statement after the board's actions was short, clear, and unadorned. She stood before cameras in a simple suit and spoke as she had in the ballroom, without rancor but without apology. "I am grateful for the diligence of our board and council," she said. "These documents are clear. My family's trust confers responsibility. Moreto Holdings and the Kalahari fields are not something to be flaunted. They are to be stewarded. Our immediate priorities will be transparency, community engagement, and environmental safeguards. We will commission independent audits and publish findings. We will establish a fund for the local populations whose lives are tied to the land." The reporters wanted spectacle. She offered a timetable. Daniel Alvarez released a registry of documents and contact points for independent verifiers. Edward announced the formation of a stewardship committee to include independent geologists and local representatives. Immani pledged public consultations in the affected regions, a gesture that both reassured some stakeholders and complicated the narratives of those who had hoped the asset would be privatized into glory. In the weeks that followed, journalists traced the trust's chain of ownership back through Moreto Holdings to a series of agreements with local authorities and concession holders. The Kalahari fields were described in industry journals not as a romanticized sea of diamonds but as a complex mineral landscape, with extraction rights regulated by a web of leases, royalties, and environmental conditions. The headlines that had once mocked the ring for a moment shifted, awkwardly, to consider questions about governance and ethics in resource management. Immani threw herself into the management task with the same methodical discipline she had once applied to lab work. She spent long days in strategy rooms, alternating between technical briefings and community meetings. Maya translated patent speak into practical initiatives for minimizing environmental impact. An independent advisory board of social development experts was convened to help design local education and job training programs. The leather journal accompanied her to each meeting, a private ledger bending beneath her pen as she recorded dates, commitments, and the names of people she would need to trust. There were obstacles. Mine operators with existing contracts pushed legal challenges and negotiated vigorously for continued operations under their leases. International partners raised questions about royalty structures and compliance with regulatory frameworks. There were protests from community groups who wanted more immediate support than slow institutional changes could deliver. Immani met these challenges by insisting on process. Audits, public reports, binding community benefit agreements that specified timelines and metrics, and governance structures that included local seats on oversight committees. One of the first tangible acts was to set up a Moreto Community Fund with transparent accounting, overseen by an independent trustee and audited annually. The fund's charter included scholarships, health clinics, and vocational training, and it required that a percentage of gross royalties be set aside for community reinvestment. Immani insisted that payment schedules be public and that expenditures be subject to community review. Measures intended to translate legal ownership into visible, accountable action. The work was not without criticism. Some accused her of grandstanding. Others suspected the company of attempting to whitewash a history of extraction. Those critiques were not baseless. They reflected the legitimate suspicion many communities had of extractive industries. But Immani's response was to broaden the circle of oversight. She invited local leaders to sit on panels. She commissioned independent environmental impact studies and pledged to publish them. She made clear that the stewardship she intended would be slow because it must be comprehensive. In the background of all of this, the Sterling name was still a social brand. There were lawsuits filed, anticipated legal actions that tried to contest the trust's terms and the board's recognition of trustee authority. Daniel Alvarez and the legal team met each filing with methodical motion practice, producing certified copies, witness affidavits, and chain of custody documents at every turn. Courts, when they were involved, found the paper trail coherent. Signatures on original filings, properly executed trust documents, trustees appointed in accordance with governing statutes. Terrence's legal maneuvers slowed some processes, but did not unmake the chain of custody Aurelia had created. Terrence, for his part, retreated into a smaller orbit. The media's appetite for his side diminished as the months lengthened and the story's weight shifted toward governance and operations. Where once his name had dominated headlines, it now appeared as a subsection in discussions about family holdings and leadership transitions. Privately, he tried to recast himself as the aggrieved husband and sympathetic executive, an angle that yielded short-lived features and social commentary. Publicly, his network thinned as former patrons and investors calculated the risk of continued association. At home, the dynamic was quieter and more complicated. Lorraine, who had been a public figure of cultivated disdain, weathered the social fallout with a brittle, controlled fury. She moved her social calendar into private dinners and private calls. Shanice, who had been adept at leveraging relationships into opportunity, found partners less eager to take a call. Both experienced an erosion of influence, not a dramatic downfall but a steady diminution that was as effective as a shutter closing over time. Immani, meanwhile, extended her energy toward institution building. She established the Aurelia Sterling Scholars Program, named for her mother, to fund young women from resource-rich but economically disadvantaged regions for studies in engineering, environmental science, and community development. The program's administration emphasized not just scholarships but mentorships and guaranteed internships within Sterling's oversight operations. Immani personally interviewed the first cohort, making the selection criteria public and ensuring the process would not be remote from the people it promised to uplift. She also initiated a mentorship network within the company. Maya became the head of the Technical Scholarship Initiative, charged with translating academic learning into practical apprenticeships that would prioritize local hires. Lyle managed the optics, less now for celebrity and more for honest representation, showcasing workers and engineers in safety gear rather than executives in tailored jackets. Jasper documented the process with careful footage that would be used for transparency reports rather than promotional reels. There were intimate moments that marked the new phase. Immani visited a community school built with Moreto Fund resources and watched children whose families had once been excluded from the mine's benefits now attend classes in a building with solar panels and textbooks furnished by the fund. The school's principal, a woman named Nala who had been an informal community leader for years, greeted Immani with frankness and gratitude. "We want jobs that keep our children here, not take them away," Nala said. Immani listened and took notes on a page in the leather journal, action items, names, deadlines. The satisfaction that came with this work was patient and not the kind of gratification the tabloids could print. It was quieter, the steady result of procedural justice. When journalists pressed Immani about her initial humiliation, she was brief and precise. "I walked into a room where a lie felt like a script," she said once, "and I chose to respond with evidence. But this is not about the ring. It is about people who have lived with decisions made on their behalf for too long. We will not use control to aggrandize. We will use it to create accountability. The legal tides ebbed and flowed. A few minor motions were dismissed. Some private settlements were reached with vendors who feared protracted litigation. In the end, the core legal recognition, the trustees' authority over Moreto's controlling interest, remained intact. The settlement language maintained confidentiality on certain financial specifics, but allowed for public reporting on the trust's stewardship and the fund's expenditures. Terrence's name, once synonymous with the family's social capital, receded from the company's leadership pages. He surrendered some directorships and, in time, agreed to step down from roles he had assumed without proper authorization. The exit was accomplished without public spectacle. Formal letters, handshakes in conference rooms, a short statement that emphasized mutual agreement to pursue separate paths. He left with a personal estate intact, but with diminished corporate sway, and more important, with a social life measured now by invitations rather than applause. Bianca dissolved from the industry in the way a person withdraws from a conversation they realize they cannot steer. She accepted a consultancy role at a small logistics firm abroad, a position that offered distance and a chance to rebuild without the glare. She wrote in a private message to Immani months later, a short note that read, "Life is a harsh teacher. I hope I learn." Immani replied, with the restraint that had become her device, "We all have room to learn. Please be well." The exchange was not a reconciliation so much as a closing of a chapter. Lorraine and Shanice lived their exile softly. No dramatic collapse, only the slow reassignment of their social energies. Pride, like wealth, changes shape when the customs that sustain it shift. Immani's days, by contrast, filled with pressing obligations and an ever-expanding list of what stewardship entailed. There were regulatory filings, community meetings, audits, and the creation of labor and safety standards that improved not only protocols but lives. She pressed for transparent royalties and independent oversight, insisting that the company's future be shaped as much by local priorities as by shareholder returns. Her message to investors was plain. Ethical, audited practices would be non-negotiable, and while returns mattered, so did legacy. There were quieter moments of reckoning, too. One November afternoon, when the first round of scholarships was announced, Immani drove out of town to a place that smelled of eucalyptus and salt. She parked at the graveyard where Aurelia was buried beneath a modest stone. The leather journal felt heavier that day, not with the burden of tasks but with gratitude and obligation. She knelt, smoothing the grass with a reverent hand. "I told them to measure twice," she said aloud, voice steady. There was no one to hear but the wind. She opened the journal and placed it by the stone. For a moment she allowed herself something close to the private grief of a daughter who had won public vindication, but still wanted her mother's counsel. She read a passage Aurelia had once scrawled in a margin, a line she had quoted often in her own head during the gala. "Name it, own it, protect it." She left a note under the journal. "We are trying to do right." It was not a proclamation. It was a promise in small script. Years later, the Moreto Initiative would be studied as a case where a family trust had shifted corporate behavior. Scholars would point to clauses Aurelia had insisted upon, and to the governance structures Immani implemented, as reasons the mine's revenues had begun to benefit the region in measurable ways. The scholarship program produced engineers who returned to local projects instead of migrating, and a significant proportion of hires at Moreto's operations came from the communities around the Kalahari fields. The fund's audit reports were public, and the transparency insisted upon by the trustees' governance diminished the opportunism that had often accompanied extractive industries. Immani did not become a celebrity philanthropist. She continued to prefer functional clothes and worked hard at not being the character the press liked to invent. She still kept the leather journal, its pages now full of names and commitments rather than the raw drafts of patents. Occasionally she reread Aurelia's handwriting and felt a small, private astonishment at how foresight had shaped public outcomes. When asked in an interview about the wedding ring, about the night it was held up like a prop, she answered with a quiet clarity that became a line picked up by pundits who preferred neat morals. He traded a ring, she said, for something he thought would make him look powerful. He did not understand that there are other, older forms of power, documents, responsibilities, the obligations written in law. The ring was a gesture meant for a crowd. The trust was a promise meant for generations. The final scenes of the story were not dramatic but slow and comprehensive. Immani established the Sterling Foundation, a non-profit arm that managed scholarships, community engagement, and independent oversight. She began to mentor young women engineers, Maya among them, as they navigated corporate life. She insisted that mentorship include legal literacy, how to read incorporation papers, how to understand fiduciary duties, how to keep ledgers. Keep receipts, she would tell them, a wry echo of her mother's phrase. Name it, own it, protect it. On the rare evenings she had free, she went to the porch of the coastal house she had bought not as a display but as a place to write. The house looked out at a narrow, steady sea. There she would sit with the leather journal on her knees and draft letters to the scholarship recipients, propose new transparency metrics, and occasionally write nothing at all, just watch the tide and the way light moved between waves. One night as the sun lowered, she took an object from a small wooden box on the table. The wedding ring Terrence had once offered as spectacle. She turned it in her fingers. It was a ring that had been taken for granted and then displayed. It had been a costume prop in a household performance. She considered the ring, then placed it back in the box. She did not wear it. It had been an instrument of a moment. She had been more interested in instruments that endured. The last image that lingered was not of triumphal public exposure but of steadier things. A scholarship letter headed to a small town in the Kalahari, a safety helmet stamped with a company's logo and a community name, a ledger entry acknowledging a payment to a local clinic, a young engineer named by a mentor who would one day sit on the oversight committee. Immani's legacy, she intended, would be less about what others said of her and more about who had better food, cleaner water, and an education because of the choices made under her stewardship. Her life after the reveal was a life of patient construction, of translating legal authority into material care. When asked what she had learned, she would sometimes say simply, "Power without responsibility is performance. Responsibility without transparency is danger. The work is to make the two meet." In a city that loved spectacle and sometimes forgot the slow work of governance, the story of the ring and the mine became a cautionary parable and, in quieter circles, a lesson. The value of knowing your documents, of insisting on procedure, and of remembering that inheritance can be a burden as well as a gift. If you found this story compelling and want more long-form narratives like this, subscribe for more and check the links for companion materials and sources.